Okay, this is going to be a quick tutorial on general how FMOD works. Here's the presentation I'm going to be giving in class. So I'm just going to kind of go through it and then do what I did in class, which is show the demo of how everything works. So using FMOD to create your ambience. So what is our goal here? Our goal is to create an ambience that's really convincing using FMOD, something that's constantly evolving and never really repeats. And so we're going to do that with all the things we've made as part of Project 1 thus far. It's going to consist of two main parts, the looping sounds and the random sounds. So how do we prepare assets for FMOD? Well, we've already discussed that in previous tutorials. So if you go to Canvas under the week, I believe this is 4, there will be the AAMP tutorials YouTube channel. That will have a 2-part video on how to do that, as well as how to download and register FMOD, because we'll be doing that too. So go there first, and that'll give you the whole rundown of how to prep your files for Pro Tools. So pause this, go do that, and then come back here. And if you already have it done, awesome. So next, now that the assets are prepped, let's move them into FMOD. So we're going to get started with FMOD. This is where the part where I'm going to talk about, go download it. The AAMP YouTube tutorial channel already has how you can do all this. So next we're going to create a new project. So let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to start a new, we have a new project here open in FMOD. It's blank, right? So we're going to go to File, Save As, and then I'm going to pull this over here. I'm just going to make this on my desktop, but we're going to call it AAMP, your initials, and then Project 1 FMOD session. Right, okay. Okay, so if you pull it up, there's actually a lot of similarities between this and a Pro Tools session. So you'll see here there's like an FMOD session right here, right? And there's also so that's like similar to your Pro Tools session, your PTX file. There's also, it's not there yet, but there will be an assets folder that's the same thing as your audio files folder as in Pro Tools, but for FMOD. You can see right here there's a screenshot of like, okay, you'll see there's an assets folder. We have it broken up into the different loop types, right? Build is something we don't need to worry about. I am going to ask, though, that you drag and drop your screenshot image into this main session as well, just so that it's easier for me when I'm grading. The photo's already there, and I don't have to guess which one you did. But yeah, so that's great. So this is our folder, right? So next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about like navigating FMOD, right? When you open a new FMOD project, it is pretty daunting. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of empty space here, you know? So we're going to start over here at the Events tab, which is in the top left-hand corner. The Events tab is where you're going to add all of your events, and you can organize them in whatever way you want. An event is basically something that the audio engine calls that will in turn play some sort of sound or do some sort of audio choreography over the speakers. So the event usually has things like sound calls, audio effects or plugins, can contain volume and pitch choreography and randomization, whatever. So game engine calls FMOD event, then we hear it over the speakers, right? When you add an event, you basically go over to the Events tab, right click, you have options for new event, event defaults, and new folder. For our purposes, we're always going to be using this 3D timeline, but there are things called 2D and 3D action, as well as 2D and 3D timeline. All of this stuff is explained in like the FMOD general tutorials, which I have on Canvas for you that you can look up and check them out. We'll be talking about them briefly later, but if you want a real deep dive on everything, that's where to go. Next we're going to talk about is the Assets tab. So Events tab is over here, then there's Banks, then there's Assets. We're not going to do anything with Banks, but we will do stuff with Assets. So Assets is in the top left-hand corner here, and this is where you're going to store all of your audio files for your FMOD project. You can just drag and drop them in. You can even drag and drop full folders in, and it will copy the folder structuring here. Not to mention, it will automatically copy all files dragged into here into the assets folder of your project. So for an example, I'm going to just drag 2 folders. These are things that I made for project 1. There's one folder called loops and one called random SFX. So if I drag and drop it, those folders appear, we open them up, and they're full of audio files, right? And then if you go over here, you'll see them having appeared with their file structure over in your project folder. So it's really, really convenient and really nice that they do this. Now that we have some stuff in there, let's move on to this big thing right here. This big main window is called the editor window. It's where you're going to do most of your editing and where you're going to use sheets, right? So sheets are basically like, think of them as your main editing space, right? There are 3 different kinds of sheets. Let me pull over the slides. There are timeline, parameter, and action sheets. So a timeline sheet, it opens up a timeline kind of like a DAW, and you can play sounds on it. And so if you have an event called like FMOD presentation, you can load it full of your loops and stuff, right? And it will play through them and whatever. You've also got something called a parameter sheet, which we are not going to be using for this class, but it's just good to know. It's similar to a timeline, but you can control where and when the playhead of the timeline is called based on a parameter, right? So you can tweak it to say, call from, timeline spot 2, and it'll play whatever's there instead of starting at the beginning. Like I said, helpful, but we won't be using it. And then last is action sheet. This is probably the simplest, where basically you just drop audio files in, and as soon as you click that event, it plays whatever sounds are there. You can choose between playing multiple sounds at the same time or one after the other, or concurrent and consecutive. And it's really good for useful quick sounds. We won't be using it, but it's helpful to know for the future. If you really like FMOD implementation and you really like middleware, then you're going to need to know these things because they're vital to working in the video game industry. Next thing we're going to talk about is logic tracks. So these ones are a little weird. In order to pull one of these up, I actually have to make a timeline really quick. So we're just going to create a new event. We're going to go to event defaults and go to 3D timeline. And we're going to call this FMOD demo presentation. You'll see here there's this little black line along the top of the timeline. This is logic tracks. So logic tracks are used to change the behavior of the playhead in timeline sheets, right? Timeline sheet. Change the behavior of the playhead playing audio back and forth, right? So good examples of this are loops or markers. You can set loops that'll basically, once the playhead makes it to the end, it'll go start at the beginning again. Hopefully you know what a loop is, but that's a good explanation of it. And markers are different. We won't be using those, but you can set markers inside of your timeline and tell programmer call from this marker, or tell an event to call from this marker, things like that. And then last thing, you'll notice that when we did this, we created this thing down here called the master track. So this little area in general at the bottom of the window is called the deck. And that's good to remember because we'll reference it, and what's down there changes kind of depending on what you're clicked on. So when you aren't selecting anything, it pulls up the master track or the master fader for the event script, right? You'll find here there's like your volume fader. They have here is your spatializer. Instead of stereo, right, because that's 2D, we'll talk about that later. When you do a 3D one, it creates a spatializer with surround sound. If you don't have a surround sound system, it automatically sums to stereo, but if you were doing this in the real world in a game, you would more than likely do it in the 3D space. So 2D puts the event that we're making into a 2D space, so only left and right. So think about things that would be on headphones, right? So these in games are going to be things like music tracks, internal character dialogue, first-person player dialogue, or anything not in the space, so potentially UI sound effects, things like that. Stuff that is not oriented in a 3D space. However, there is the 3D, which puts an event in the 3D space and plays the file in relation to the player's location. So this is where the spatializer comes in, right? Because you can tie certain events to 3D objects inside of your game later on as a programmer, right? So it's really helpful to have that there, because if your event is tied over here and you're all the way over here, you want to hear like things are over here, right? And that's why you need the 3D spatializer on. You can go deep dive with this really hardcore. For us, I'm putting it in 3D because if you want to experiment with these things, your session ambience will already be made and you can play around and have fun with it. But for our purposes, we're mostly just going to be randomizing audio files playing within a fake 3D space, right? Since we don't have an actual surround sound set up. Like I said before, everything for this project should be in 3D space. It doesn't truly matter, but it is good for if you want to explore with this later on your own time. So how do we make FMOD play a sound, right? We've talked so much about timelines and setup and everything, but how do you actually get it to make a noise, right? You need to pull up what's called an instrument. So an FMOD instrument is different from like a regular instrument, right? An instrument is basically a component required to play a sound within an FMOD sheet. So for us, the sheet is the timeline, right? You put a sound into the instrument, which is played by the sheet, and that goes to your output. And there's like a little nice diagram of it right here. For me, it helps to think of it like as a music person, right? So the instrument is kind of like a sampler, kinda, and the sounds are being loaded into it, right? And instead of hitting a pad on a keyboard or a pad on a drum machine, a timeline is triggering the samples, right? There are many different kinds of instruments in FMOD, but we're only going to be really using two. One is the single instrument, which plays one sound and gives you a few parameters to tweak. And then there's the scatterer instrument, which is a weird name. It should just be called the scatter instrument, but whatever. It allows you to call groups of sounds at random and randomizes how often you hear them, the pitch, the volume, and even which audio file is being called, because you can use clusters of sounds, clusters of audio files, and it'll pick different ones, right? So that way you have like kind of endless randomization. I think I'll split the video here. So go find the next one on Canvas that talks about how to actually do the tutorial for the project. Yeah, bye-bye.